Uh, Thanks for being here this afternoon. My name is Dan Reed. I'm the Regional Policy Director for Greater Washington. We're one of the co-organizers of this event, and this has been a long time coming, and I am so grateful for you to be here today. I lost my voice last weekend, so I'm going to try and conserve it as much as I can this afternoon. This panel is about policy solutions and replicable policies to advance equitable TOD. You know, as we've seen across the region, there's a massive transit expansion happening right now. The Silver Line opened last month. The Purple Line is under construction. And with that come many, many opportunities to create more equitable communities around these new transit lines and around the transit we already have in this region. So with me today are four luminaries in this space who have helped to either advance policies that support equitable TOD or to actually make equitable TOD come out of the ground. So I'm going to turn it over to my four panelists here and give them each a minute to introduce themselves, and then we're going to go through some questions, and then after that we're going to have question and answer time. So start thinking of some stumpers. But first, I'm going to hand it. Oh, and actually before I do that, if you'd like to learn more about our panelists today or any of our speakers today, there is a QR code up on the screen, I am told, that if you point your phone at it, you'll get to see all of the speaker bios today. And if you don't see it, on the About Today's event page, there is a QR code as well as a URL. And if you're using social media today, smash that hashtag AdvancingETOD so we can share out about today's event and make everyone jealous who wasn't here. All right, I'm going to hand it over now to Angie Rodgers, the Deputy Chief Administrative Officer for Prince George's County, to kick us off with introductions.
Thank you. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I'm mic'd.
Nope.
I got to remember that before I hot mic. So it's great to be here with you all, and I'm actually getting over a cold as well, and so I got my cough drops here and my water to make sure I don't cough all over everyone. But it's great to be here with you all. So I'm the Deputy CAO for Economic Development in Prince George's County, Maryland. Started with the county in February 2020, right before the pandemic started. So those were interesting times. I oversee the cluster of government agencies that includes all of our real estate development agencies, so that's our DHCD and our Housing Authority and Revenue and Redevelopment Authority, as well as all of our business development and corporate attraction agencies, and serve as a liaison to our Park and Planning Commission. And I am responsible for the county's strategic direction as it relates to all of economic development in Prince George's County. And as I like to say, it is my responsibility to turn all of our 498 square miles into meaningful economic development. So good to be here.
Well, good afternoon again. I'm Christian Dorsey, and I'll talk to you this afternoon in my capacity as a local elected official and vice chair of the Arlington County Board. We are a community in Arlington that has long been associated with smart growth, with the advent of heavy rail development, first in our Roslyn-Ballston corridor and also our Richmond Highway corridor. And as we think about the evolution of smart growth in our community, I suppose we're at Smart Growth 2.0, where we're looking to, number one, figure out what's next for those communities that were established long ago, but really also how to apply the principles that we've learned over the years to other emerging areas that are a planning focus, including our Columbia Pike corridor, which is one of the most diverse communities in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but then also to other areas of our county which have hitherto been left out of comprehensive planning and the benefits of smart growth, but are certainly ripe for achieving them, such as our Langston Boulevard corridor, and really looking at how we can further our learnings into the incredible communities that have been created around this transit infrastructure. It's one of those things where I doubt that the forerunners who brought us the heavy rail investments in Arlington would have known that all along for example, the Roslyn-Boston corridor, that each of those nodes would become their own distinct communities with own distinct identities that very much created an attachment for the people who live there. And so we want to take all the benefit of the lessons learned both positively and negatively and apply it to the next iteration of how Arlington develops and redevelops.
I'll just go. Welcome to Bethesda, everybody. I'm Evan Glass. I'm one of the at-large members of the council, and as of yesterday, I'm also president of the county council. Thank you. It is nice to be back in the Strathmore, where I was earlier this morning, and you'll hear more about that, but also we had our inauguration here on Monday, where the county council increased from 9 to 11 members to better represent the diversity that we have. And of those 11 members, 6 of them are women, and it is the most diverse culturally, gender, and every other way we can think of council that we've ever had in our history. So welcome to Montgomery County. And so what brought me to Montgomery County, or more specifically what brought me here, is that through my 20 plus years of living here, I first started getting involved civically in transit-oriented development. Having moved to downtown Silver Spring, I'll share more of that later, but the reality is that here in Montgomery County, 500 square miles, 2 more maybe than Prince George's of 498. But the 500 square miles that we have, 1/3 of it is designated agricultural. We have an award-winning national agricultural reserve here, and so when we talk about growth, we talk about development, we have to be very thoughtful about what it is and where we do it, because we want to protect some of our natural land. And if you haven't been to our breweries, cideries, and distilleries, come on back. It's a little more north than here. But as these conversations continue and our population continues to grow, because we do not build walls around Montgomery County, we need to accommodate everybody. And so I look forward to this conversation.
Great. I'm Andy Altman. I'm a principal of Fivesquares Development. We had the honor of being able to host a groundbreaking here this morning. Thanks very much to Amazon and Catherine, there's Catherine, made that possible. So we're very excited, and council members Glass, and I think Hans Reamer was here, or still here, who really made the legislation happen, the pilot legislation that allowed that hole in the ground and transit-oriented community to come up. So we're thrilled. We're a small development company based in Washington, D.C. We work in D.C. and here at Strathmore, Montgomery County, mostly doing kind of transit-oriented, mission-oriented development. But probably the perspective I can also offer, which is purely a function of age, meaning being older, is I've had the good fortune of working on transit-oriented communities in a number of different cities as a planning director. So I've kind of seen ways that tried to promote transit-oriented communities, the obstacles to that. Started out in Oakland, California as a planning director. Was in the district under Mayor Tony Williams from 2000 to 2004, 5, working there. I see Ellen McCarthy, who is a deputy planning director, working on trying to promote downtown housing, which seems like a bit like what would have been the obstacle to downtown housing, given how much housing, but there was a massive obstacles to that at the time and opposition to it. To Philadelphia, where I was the deputy mayor of planning and economic development, trying to promote transit-oriented communities, and in London, working on the Olympics, which was kind of a transit-oriented community, literally on, well, I'd say on steroids, but I guess with the Olympics that might not be right, but or maybe is right exactly, but that was sort of on steroids, and now back here to form this small development company, and fortunate to work on projects like this that can be meaningful. So. Thanks.
Awesome. So I have questions for each of you all, but I'm going to invite, once the person's answered the question, for you to jump in, and I have some questions for all of you all. So we're going to have a nice, robust conversation, and then, as a reminder, question and answer time. Think of questions, and Kellyanne's going to go around with the mic when that happens. But first of all, I'm going to start with the council president, Evan Glass. So you alluded to just now that you began, your career in advocacy for transit-oriented development, and both as council president and as vice president of the board of Montgomery Housing Partnership, you've dealt with some community opposition to affordable housing. How do we negotiate that? For all the good things we're talking about today.
Sure. So a little bit more about me. I went to American University, and then upon graduation, knew I wanted to stay in D.C. After having a group house in Bethesda, I ended up settling in downtown Silver Spring, finding a very affordable apartment. And the best part of it was I was able to keep my car at the apartment and walk to the metro, right? And at the time, I used to be a journalist before getting into politics. I worked at CNN for 12 years. And so in the late 90s, early aughts, it was an easy red line commute from Silver Spring down to Union Station. And as my personal economy changed, I decided I wanted to settle down my roots and stop renting and buy a condo. And thanks to people like former council member George Leventhal and of course Hans Riemer later on, downtown Silver Spring became a thriving transit-oriented hub. And when some of the first condos that then Councilmember George Leventhal helped promote were coming up online, I decided I wanted to buy one. And so I moved into a condo in a brand new community called South Silver Spring, or quite frankly, it did not have a name yet because it was right on the border of Eastern Avenue, and across was Shepherd Park. And so as I'm walking to the metro back and forth every day, I noticed a few years later that there was an apartment building that was coming online. And people started contacting me, and the former council member, Valerie Irvin, contacted me as the president of this newly formed neighborhood and said, people are concerned because there's going to be affordable housing there. And they're concerned. And I was a journalist, and I said, I don't really know much about affordable housing, so let me make some phone calls. And just as any good reporter would, I started calling sources. Explain to me what affordable housing is. So I spoke to DHCA, who then told me the developer who wanted to develop the building, and then who then gave me the number of the management company who would explain how it would be managed in the inclusive process. And so I reported and then ultimately wrote a blog post for the neighborhood and said, dear neighbors, this is affordable housing. About a third of it is going to be for people who make between around 40% AMI. About a third of it is going to be for people who make between 60 and 70% AMI, and then about the remaining third will be somewhere near market rate. So neighbors, who do you not want living in our neighborhood? Do you not want the recent college grad? Do you not want the first-year teacher? Do you not want the empty nester? Please let me know who you don't want, because this is a building for everybody. And by the time I, as the president of the organization, the Civic Association, had organized a meeting, not one naysayer showed up because they'd read the blog post, they were informed. And that took a lot out of my time. And communication, at least then, was my skill set. And so I did the reporting, and I shared with them, because I ultimately believe we have to meet people where they're at. And it's that same philosophy that when I first got into politics, after leaving CNN, I joined the Board of Equality Maryland. And back when we were still fighting for marriage equality, it was have conversations, tell people you're gay, normalize it, and help change hearts and minds. And that's how I perceive the debate about affordable housing. We have to continue changing hearts and minds, meeting people where they're at, and explaining to them exactly who is moving into our neighborhood, and challenging them, who do you not want in our neighborhood?
Dan, if you don't mind, I want to chime in on this question as well, because I'm struck by some of the concepts that were in Calvin's presentation, really sort of bringing together this whole smart growth landscape, right, which is, sustainability on climate, plus affordable housing, plus transit-oriented communities. And one of the things I want to point out about this is that, increasingly, these arguments are being used in certain contexts to undermine the affordable housing case. And I think as advocates and practitioners, we have to continue to do what Calvin was doing in that presentation, which is to bring this together for folks and, make the case for how these things feed each other, and not allow the climate argument to undermine the, we need more dense development around transit stations that bring people closer to jobs and amenities, and undermine the affordable housing argument, because that is actively happening in a lot of our communities. And I think it's up to us to kind of turn the tide on that argument.
And if I could just respond to that or add upon it as well, some of the criticisms that I'm hearing these days as a council member is regarding affordable housing, and it's not new to any of you. Well, if there's any market rate, it can't be affordable, right? We don't want that, but unless it's 100% affordable, right? Because then you make the moral argument, the ethical argument for it. But we know how hard that is, and that's probably the hardest type of housing to build. And so an extension of the communication is explaining to them, as I have in communities where we've walked around proposed sites, is how difficult it is to build affordable housing and how it takes public sector, taxpayer dollars, but then support from the real estate industry. These days, support from Amazon and other incredible philanthropists and corporations to help too, but educating people as to why there needs to be mixed rate in a building and that we should not have this proposition where it's 100% or nothing.
And if I could add, and I don't want to presume that I have the answer to this question. If I did, I would be a pretty estimable individual. But a couple of observations over the years. Affordable housing and the concept of it is really tied up into this very complicated mythology. And much like many of us can recite chapter and verse, the story about George Washington and the cherry tree and these other mythological things, there are many people in this country who hear the words affordable housing, and regardless of whether or not they ever had any firsthand proximate awareness of Cabrini Green in Chicago or some of the problems with housing developments in the South Bronx in the 70s, for example, that's the image that comes up for them when you put those two words together. And it's striking since relative small share of the population was even live, aware, understanding what those things were, but people see that even in suburban Maryland, even in Northern Virginia. And so one, you have to get past that mythology, and you really can't do that on an ad hoc basis when you've got a great project idea. You can't go ahead and say, yeah, we're going to reverse that thinking that's been built up and calcified in your mind when we have this decision point of a particular project. So we really have to orient ourselves for the long haul on trying to open people up to facts and awareness so that we can sort of break down what has been built up in terms of what they see when they hear those terms. And I think we sometimes get enamored with trying to do things that we think are gonna do it quickly. Like, instead of talking about affordable housing, let's talk about housing affordability. And that's a Jedi mind trick that, I get why we do it, but it actually doesn't entirely work because people still are gonna see that unless they've been exposed to a process to see something differently. And that's the great benefit that I think we have in our area. Just countless number of communities that have had levels of 100% affordability, mixed income, the entire spectrum, that are not only incredibly successful in terms of being assets to the community, but incredible architectural features that people are excited about, places where people thrive. And so this is just a plea that we engage in this on an ongoing basis and realize there's gonna be a process of sort of correcting what has been sort of this decades of built up bias against what affordable housing means.
So I actually have another question for you, Vice Chair Dorsey.
Yes.
Arlington County has been a leader in TOD for decades, as you mentioned. How do we get from TOD and the models that have been created in Arlington County that have been followed all over the nation to ETOD?
Yeah. Thank you for that, Dan. So bringing equity into this and Calvin's perspective is just so incredibly important here. It's not about the projects themselves. It's about really understanding the assets of the community that you're trying to work with. So I'm just going to cite one example of how we're trying to bring this into play. We have this community, a huge 64-acre site within Arlington County. It's one of the biggest sites that you could ever imagine being available in Arlington. And over the course of over 100 years, it has served as a place that at first was kind of like a luxury apartment community for people who were of means, and later, as Arlington grew, it became a place where modest income federal workers could rent before they built up the savings to then purchase a home, and then later it has become a place where immigrant communities have been welcomed because of the relatively affordable rents. Anyway, this community with this incredible rich history that now is home to just this incredible thriving place where diversity is lived by the people who are there, and so much value is created for the community, was at risk of going away because the family was going to sell it. And when you think about a 64-acre site, the number of groups out there that could maybe participate in buying that, pretty small. And we were looking at something that would have been catastrophic for us, seeing that asset go away and just simply be redeveloped at prevailing market rates. Thankfully, we had a developer who had an interest in partnering with the community, and we also had the Amazon Equity Fund, which had been fully stood up and was available to help to acquire this site. And we now are working through the process over the next 10 years of master planning for not only the retention of at least the number of households serving people as low as 30% of area median income in this community, but to also be able to, through added density and other investments, really create a model community where we can have absolutely no displacement of existing people, but also creating more value from it. It was only possible because there are a lot of different players who recognize the importance of it, but it didn't happen overnight. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. The work had been done beforehand. The equity fund had been stood up. It was available. We had talked for years about we have to preserve this at all costs. So when the circumstance came where we had to do something, everyone was able to mobilize fairly quickly and do something transformative. And that's the approach that I think we need to take if we're going to think about equitable development. You have to plan for it. You have to be mindful of it well in advance. You have to see it before it materializes, because if you just wait until the action inflection point comes, it's likely going to be too late.
Oh, I don't know if you want us all to chime in on this. We use the term equity, and it encompasses so much. And I'm going to make 2 points that are sort of vastly different, but both sort of under this umbrella of equity. The first point that I want to make is about transit. Obviously, we're coming out of a global pandemic, and we saw ridership on Metro, drastically decrease during the pandemic, and this conversation sort of ongoing as we're coming out of it about whether, whether as a community we're going to return to Metro. And I have been positing to people that is not the question we should be asking. We should take that as a given, because it is an equity issue. Thank you. I'm going to take you everywhere I go. The communities or the parts of our community that can have the wealth and income and freedom to make choices will make their choices. But the folks in our community who we need to be working to move them closer to transit so that they can be closer to their jobs, that this is our challenge. And so it's not an if, it's how do we insulate our transit system so that it is safe during these types of situations, which are going to continue to happen. All the scientists say, right? Like, this is going to happen again. So I want to make that point because I think access to transit is an equity issue, and that we've never gotten far enough along where we figured out how to truly catalyze communities around transit and also make sure that low-income households of color, have equal access to that. And that's the thing we should be continuing to work toward. The second equity issue that I'll posit is because I work and live in a majority minority county in the region, And the equity issue for us is really about how do we make sure that that majority minority community can compete the same way as other counties around the region. As we have been competing for this FBI headquarters relocation, I've been using this data point that I think Connected DMV put the data out there, but when you look at the growth of wealth and income in counties across the country, and you look at the 150 largest counties, Fairfax County is number 2 on that list. Prince George's County is number 142 on that list. And so I kind of chide people in Prince George's County because they talk about, oh, Prince George's County, it's one of the wealthiest majority minority counties in the country, communities in the country. And I'm like, but you're number 142 compared to number 2 Fairfax. You need to be trying to figure out how we get to number 2. Mm-hmm. Because as a region, to have all of these communities around us that have these incredible posits of wealth, and to have Prince George's County that is not participating in that. So when the region rebounds from a recession, we're not rebounding. The Black community is not rebounding. And so that's an equity issue for us as a majority minority community, figuring out how we get on the same stage as the majority white communities in the region.
And I just wanted to pick up on the equitable aspect of TOD. In order for TOD to exist, you need the transit. And with respect to the pandemic, as has been shared, when ridership plummeted across the board, of course there were calls to reduce service. We felt it in our budgets. We didn't know what kind of hit our coffers would incur. And so people wanted to cut the metro budget. They wanted to cut our ride-on budget or the bus budget, right? But when we started examining that, we realized that is clearly the least equitable thing that can be done, because the people who were still taking transit during the pandemic were our first responders, the people working at in stores, the people working in commerce, right, who didn't have any other options. And here in Montgomery County, one of the reasons I have been leading the effort to make our buses free, and I'm jealous of all of you in the district, right? But the reason is, when you look at who the ridership is in Montgomery County for our buses in particular, the average household income in Montgomery County is $108,000. The average household income for our bus riders is $35,000. That's the equity in transit-oriented development. And that's something we need to keep in mind moving forward.
So my next question is for Andy Altman. So, we're in a very wealthy community right here at Strathmore. There are a number of high-end developments up and down Rockville Pike. It would have been easy to come in, put up a bunch of luxury apartments, do the minimum required for MPDU and call it a day. What does it mean to have this commitment for affordable housing here at Strathmore Square?
That's a good question. So, first of all, I think Strathmore Square, which is right here for those of you who were this morning, is just next door to the parking lot at the WMATA Metro. I think, first of all, it's important to understand a challenge that one of the things that's really was difficult here, and is difficult even in a wealthy area of Montgomery County, as you say, is that if you look around, there's not a lot of development that's happened at the metro stations in many areas, because there is an assumption that growth will just happen. But it hasn't, because there's a disconnect between the sort of the policy and the market, which is that even in higher income areas such as this, it still wasn't sufficient, right? The rents weren't high enough to support high density housing, which is interesting because it doesn't seem counterintuitive, right? But it just didn't work. And I think it's a very interesting case study, because it's a challenge I think it was a challenge for members of the council. It was a challenge for us because, as we started out on the path of getting the right zone, the right plan in place, which was done. The county had great growth policies, right? I mean, Hans Dreamer's here, and the council members are here, and Evan and others who supported great smart growth policies. The Planning Commission had, adopted those policies. We did master plans that then had high density development, and yet years and years, you'd say, wait a minute, why hasn't that happened? Why hasn't that growth happened? And we had started this 8 years ago on that road, and then got to the point of actually saying, okay, let's now implement the transit-oriented community policy, right? High-density housing, this should work, right? The demographics, it didn't work because the cost of high-rise construction was too great. The rents, even though they are higher than other places, are very different than Bethesda. The difference between Bethesda rents and here, 2 metro stops away, is there's between, $3.50 rent and $2.50 rent. I mean, it can be significant enough to make a difference. So the real question was, could you get development? Yes, but it would be stick-built development, which would be much less density and not maximize sites on scarce resources, which is metro. So having gone through that for 7 years, this is what's in a kind of instructive case study, which is finally, the last thing we wanted to do was to go to the government, right? We went to like 30, 40, I can't tell you how many presentations. Here's Montgomery County, here's all the numbers, exactly what you said, right? This is obvious, right? And don't you love the vision? They love the vision. Yes, 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 yes. We'll just run some numbers and get back to you. Every time they come back, yeah, sorry, this just doesn't make it. And we'd be crushed every time. So finally, after going through this, 30 times of presentations and doing the vision and doing the policy and everything's positive, we finally said, we have to find another way to do this. And that meant challenging ourselves, but also then sitting down, we went to then Councilmember Reamer and Friedson and members of the council and said, what can we do here? And we looked at these WMATA sites, and President, I say President now because he's a council member, but President said this well this morning. He said, look, the problem is that you can look around and empirically these sites are not developing, right? Why is that? There is a problem. There's a market disconnect between the policy and what the economics will support. But a way to do this that could be easy, relatively easy, is that these sites, these WMATA sites, are not throwing off taxes today to the county. So we're not taking anything off the tax roll, but it could potentially start to fill the gap, right? And that you have in your power to create this pilot, which is essentially a tax abatement legislation. It's not taking revenue today. You have to believe in, though, the fundamental thesis. And I think this was hard because you had to say, well, wait a minute, what's the but for? Am I actually, this is going to happen anyway, so am I giving up what would have been tax revenue? It was a hard one, I think, for suburbs. I can't speak, I say that, I shouldn't generalize that much, but I do think, as a person who's been seeing, there's a kind of, well, growth will happen in many areas, right? I'm talking about Montgomery County more so, I'm not talking about all areas. Suburbs, but in Virginia, many places, right? Or suburbs I've worked in, right? Growth will happen, it's inevitable. We don't have to do anything in terms of we can do land use policy, we don't have to use our other powers to do that, our taxing powers, our fiscal powers, what we can do. And I think it was a real challenge to be able to first, you can show the numbers all day long, but you also have to kind of get yourself psychologically, are we willing to do that? Do we need to do that? It was almost like a perception of, we don't need to do that. We're Montgomery County, right? We don't have to do that. I mean, maybe some areas you want to incentivize Silver Spring, they started that years ago, but they looked at this corridor and said, this is a high growth corridor. You have to get past that, but it wouldn't have happened. The hole in the ground today wouldn't have happened. So I think the instructive thing is, and then that allowed, an Amazon to come in and say, oh, look at what the local government has done. That started to close the gap. And now we want to not only get the 15%, but we want to get more affordable, and we can leverage off of what the county, has done in terms of their tax policy. They could come in and really make that financing work, not only to, to be the juice that accelerated all of this. And I think it starts to get into a more complex, multi-layered financing proposition. So what's the lesson there? The lesson for me of all of that is that, it's a question of how you link your transit-oriented, your land use policy integrated with your other levers that you have as local government, and how you put that whole package together. And be clear on your policy goals, right? We want more affordable housing at these sites if we're going to do this. In the county, for example, in this pilot legislation, amendment from the council was very clearly this: we have a 15% MPDU requirement, but if we're going to do this pilot legislation, that 25% of those 15% MPDUs are going to be at 50% of AMI. So in the county, it's 70% AMI for the MPDUs. So now they said if we're going to do this pilot, we're going to make sure that 25% of that requirement are at 50% AMI. And that could be tailored to any particular circumstance in the county it was to get it. They also said that 25% of all jobs on site would be local Montgomery County residents, right? So they started to layer in what are the policies. And there's a balancing point of what works and what doesn't work, and there was a lot of debate. So I think that's, I think to me the key message though, and why I think there was a real model here of what Montgomery County did, and again, I've seen this in many places, right? I could talk about what DC did, as I said before, with housing in the year 2000 when you would have thought housing was obvious downtown, and we had to do a tax abatement to incentivize downtown housing, which seems insane today. But at the time, that's the only way it bridged that gap. It's challenging in each particular circumstance. If we're really serious about these goals of transit-oriented communities, if we're serious about higher density housing to maximize sites, if we're serious about our other public policy goals, what do we put together as the combination of incentives, land use, fiscal, capital improvements, whatever it may be, and that's going to take a challenging of mindset as well as bringing constituencies together to support that.
So real quick, when Andy said that there was some debate, he was very minimalistic in what he said. Not only was there much debate, but there was a executive veto on the authorizing legislation, because a number of members of the council and the county executive basically deemed this tax abatement a giveaway. Yeah. We're just giving away money, giving away taxpayer money to developers, they said. And they don't need it. And when I pushed back as a co-sponsor of the legislation, as a supporter, and supported it when it started to be deteriorated in other legislation, my point to colleagues and to those in the community who didn't like it was, if you support transit-oriented development in North Bethesda and in Grosvenor and in Glenmont and in Forest Glen, why isn't it there? There's some reason it hasn't happened here, because it's all over Northern Virginia. It's sprouting up, starting to. The plans are there in Prince George's and DC, right? And so what are we not doing here? And clearly it's a financial problem. And so just like we want to invest in schools, invest in transit, and invest in so many good things like health and human services, if we truly want TOD, we need to invest in it, and that's what we did with our taxpaying dollars.
That's a common sentiment, though. I mean, we were doing a pilot for a project right at a metro station recently, and a Business Journal reporter asked us, why do you need to do these incentives for projects at the metro? Like, aren't they going to happen anyway? And it's like, no, not necessarily. Like, it depends on the community. It depends on what the barriers are. And in this area, you're exactly, if the market could make it happen in this area, the market will make it happen. Yeah. And so if it's not happening, then you got to start to kind of dig in and figure out, like, is this important to us and why, and what are the tools that we need to shoehorn in to make it happen?
If I can just have it noted that, I'm truly committed to regionalism, that when President Glass said, why Northern Virginia and not here, I said nothing, all right? Just please, for the record.
It's very good.
I appreciate your commitment to cooperation. I want to jump on what you just said, Angie, about if the market wants it, it'll happen, So there are still a lot of opportunities for development near metro stations in Prince George's County. Yeah. And it seems like a chance to maybe talk about how might ETOD look different in Prince George's as things start to move forward?
Go back to my conversation about Prince George's being able to compete the way that the rest of the jurisdictions in the region compete. I don't know that we want it to look different. We are trying to look like some of the other communities in the region that have had the kind of growth that we are still looking to have. We had to start with a change in mindset. It was very intentional, I think, for decades, for Prince George's to be this bedroom community and to focus on single family, townhouse development, this is where people live, this is not where they work. And we are not necessarily focused on dense multi-use development, near transit, that attracts jobs, attracts amenities, and has a diverse range of housing types, including affordable housing. That was not the agenda. So we had to change that agenda, and all of our planning and zoning strategies had to change to support that, and all of our tools had to change to support that. I think now that we are, sort of over some of those mindset and policy hurdles, now we've got and we've been trying to sort of forge this role as the public sector partner to change the infrastructure, change access around our transit stations to make it ripe for development. So equitable TOD for us looks like trying to have our transit centers be where people work, live, and access their amenities, and to have that growth in this majority-minority community that hopefully retains that identity. There are other things that we're sort of doing, I think, around it. That's sort of the central tenet. But I'll talk about our Blue Line corridor, which is the transit corridor that runs from Capitol Heights Metro all the way out to downtown Largo and includes Central Avenue. It is the anchor initiative for our new economic development platform. And, we formed that anchor initiative to be the sort of culmination of a more holistic economic development strategy that includes affordable housing, that includes eliminating food deserts, sort of all of these equity tenets for us. Recently, on the redevelopment of our Cheverly Hospital site, we put a 40% minority equity sponsor requirement on that project. And on the Blue Line corridor, we'd be looking to continue sort of the same thing. This is, of course, there is the idea that we will have minority and small business participation in the development that happens along these corridors. And I think Calvin talked a little bit about that in his presentation as well. But also that equity sponsorship is about having ownership, not just participation. And that's something that I think we are keenly aware of and want to sort of forge at the beginning of this. How do we get minority ownership in these projects, not just participation? I think we have some HRNA folks in the room. HRNA is helping us right now with a study for an equity-focused bid for our Blue Line corridor, and specifically equity-focused because a bid that doesn't just focus on business, doesn't focus on small business, but specifically focuses on minority business and minority business incubation along the corridor. If we're going to have a clean team, it's a re-entry jobs program, not just a clean team. So these are the kinds of things that we are thinking about sort of infusing into our work as we try to become a job center, to get more multifamily and affordable development, to get more amenities, and all centered inside the Beltway around transit. That's where all of our efforts are.
Awesome, thank you. I want to turn to Q&A in a second, but first I'm going to throw y'all a curveball.
What?
Where do you think we go from here in terms of ETOD in 3 words? How about in a sentence? We'll give you the whole sentence.
3 words on
Try.
TOD. I'm on board.
That's more of a spitball than a curveball, but
I'm trying.
You know, I would say that it's really it's actually not that complicated. It's about translating rhetoric into action. So slightly more than 3.
4 words.
More, faster.
2 words. So offset 2 and 4.
I'm kind of trying to.
Average to 3.
Build Black ownership.
Thank you. All right. On that note, I'd like you to give it up for our panelists.
Thank you.